This re-examination of the card diagram begins with Russell's cards actual diagram, in which the three scales of the centers, parts of centers, and parts of centers are shown as the three stories of a human being, stacked one above another. See pages 48 and 49 in Cosmic Secrets, so that their notes align. The six tallest cards, located on the inner notes of an octave in scale 0, are the aces and jokers, and represent the six centers of function of a human being: the instinctive, the ace of diamonds; moving, the ace of clubs; emotional, the ace of hearts; intellectual, the ace of spades; higher emotional, the extra joker; and higher mental, the joker. The 18 middle-sized cards between them, face cards, jokers, and aces, represent the parts of those centers. These operate with automatic, mechanical, drawn, and directed attention, respectively. They are located on the inner notes of the three octaves in scale 1, which constitute the three stories of a human being. Finally, the smallest cards, the entire deck of 54, is placed between the mid-size scale 1 cards to represent the parts of centers, making up the 9 octaves in scale 2. They also indicate that these smallest parts of parts operate with gradations of mechanical drawn and directed attention. What is most clear when the three stories are stacked in this way is that in the bottom 2 stories all of the red cards representing the essence or given centers are now on the left side of the diagram, and the black cards representing the personality or acquired centers are all on the right. Each story has both an essence and a personality center, but the cards are mixed in the top story, which unifies both given and acquired centers. Then the three stories unstack to form a single scale 0 octave, with scale 1 and scale 2 cards still located between the scale 0 cards. The entire scale 0 octave is now in one line, and the La-T interval of the scale question mark octave appears below it. As discussed in Chapter 3, this interval constitutes the octave that humankind should be filling if we were each awake and possessed of a conscience, and the 7 intervals of the scale 0 octave complete that La-T interval in the octave of organic life. But the notes and cards of the card's actual diagram are not spaced out according to the frequencies of the notes. Changing the diagram to a drawing of the octave to scale according to frequency is our next task. The first drawing below the La-T interval in scale question mark is drawn to scale horizontally by frequency. As introduced in the dualities animation, this symbol of an octave shows the ranges from bottom do to top do of the 2 oscillating scale 1 dos below the scale 0 octave. The ranges are the red and black double-headed arrows drawn onto the scale 0 octave. The minor and major oscillations of these oscillating dos in scale 1 are the green and blue sine waves shown on the scale 0 octave. The minor oscillation always centers on the note Mi on the scale above the oscillating dos, and the major oscillation centers on the note So in the scale above them. The oscillating dos themselves are located at the right ends of the first 2 black arrows of the lower scale inner octave, directly under the upper octaves Mi and So. We must always remember that the oscillations shown at each scale are actually the oscillations of the oscillating dos immediately below them in the next scale down. Please review the dualities animation if this is not clear. Although the 3 scale 1 and 9 scale 2 inner octaves are added without labels, we can still see where the notes are located in each inner octave. The bottom do disappears because do to re is a period of gestation. Re is always at the left end of the red arrows. Mi is at the centers of the minor oscillations in the scale below, in green. Fa divides the oscillations from each other. So is at the centers of the major oscillations in the scale below, in blue, with La at their right ends. And Ti is 5/8 of the way from La to the top do, which is at the right ends of the black arrows. The original card diagram then disappears, and the note names are replaced by the card labels. Then a legend appears describing the centers of a human being, their parts and parts of parts, now on a 2-scale diagram. The 6 centers of function in human beings are still located on the 6 inner notes of the scale 0 octave. The 3 parts of these 6 centers, 18 cards, fall on the inner notes of the 3 scale 1 inner octaves. Finally, the entire deck of 54 cards is located on the inner notes of the bottom 9 scale 2 inner octaves, representing the parts of centers. This diagram, see page 48 of Cosmic Secrets, shows the sequence of the centers in scale 0 and how they align with the notes of an enneagram. This helps one understand that each note is associated with the center aligned with it and acquires that flavor. In scale 1, we see how each of the lower 4 centers is in turn composed of 3 parts, a mechanical, emotional, and intellectual part, the jacks, queens, and kings. The aces and jokers in scale 1 represent the parts of the higher 2 centers. In scale 2, each part of a center is likewise shown to be composed of a mechanical, emotional, and intellectual part. But Russell realized that there were 2 difficulties with this original card diagram. First, each center has a somewhat independent existence, but things which come into being in this world of time and space are best represented by oscillations, which are spaces, rather than by notes at single points. They owe their existence to being bound together in webs of harmonic stability. Secondly, if this chart is to represent an ascending octave in time, the elements at the lowest frequency should be the simplest. For instance, the frequency of the Jack of Diamonds, which represents only the most automatic of instinctive functions, should precede the frequency of the Ace of Diamonds, representing the entire instinctive center. And so Russell created a second card diagram in which the card labels were on the oscillations rather than on the notes. One of the most remarkable aspects of this inner octave structure of 2, 6, 18, and 54 cards in 4 rows is that it is exactly duplicated when the card labels are moved from being on the notes to being at the centers of the oscillations, at Mi and So, of the octaves of the next scale down. This new arrangement is more accurate than the original card diagram because the simplest parts are now at the lowest frequencies and occur in harmonically stable spaces centered on the oscillating does. This new arrangement also groups the cards into pairs, dualities, which are bound together, and provides a great deal of new information. Let's examine the essence centers first, which are the minor oscillations in scale 1, always centered on the note Mi. Because this drawing locates the notes to scale by frequency, it's clear that the minor oscillation of the Jack of Diamonds in scale 2, representing the simplest, most automatic part of the instinctive center, is now shown as fully complete and functioning at the Fa in the far left octave of scale 2, before the oscillation of the entire center, the Ace of Diamonds, in scale 1, can begin. The emotional part of the instinctive center, the Queen of Diamonds, a major oscillation in scale 2, begins at the start of the entire center's oscillation, at Fa in scale 2. The central frequency of the instinctive center at the scale 2 do directly below the mi in scale 1 is not reached until the full range of the oscillating do of its emotional part is completed at the right end of the black arrow in scale 2. But control of an essence or given center is not achieved until the intellectual part, in this case the minor oscillation of the king of diamonds, has completed its oscillation, which also completes the instinctive center itself. Note that the central frequency of the intellectual part is higher than the central frequency of the center as a whole, giving it control over the entire center. Now let's look at the parts of a major oscillation center, the ace of clubs, the moving center. The first thing to notice is that the jack of clubs is the major oscillation in a duality with the minor oscillation of the king of diamonds. Thus, they are bound together. That is, the control of the instinctive center, given by the completion of the king of diamonds in scale 2, is what leads to and makes movement possible, beginning with the most automatic movements represented by the jack of clubs. We can see that only when an organism can control its chemistry on both its right and left side can it have the freedom to move in either direction. The moving center, the major oscillation of the ace of clubs, begins with its most mechanical part, the jack, and its central frequency is not reached until the range of the oscillating do of the jack is complete at the right end of the black arrow of the second octave in scale 2. The end of the oscillation of the ace of clubs is not reached until the minor oscillation of the queen of clubs, its emotional part, completes its oscillation. Finally, the major oscillation of the king of clubs, the intellectual part of the moving center, only begins after the oscillation of the ace of clubs is complete. It exerts control over the entire moving center. Acquiring the intellectual parts of acquired major oscillation centers takes a lot of effort. The same arguments apply to the major and minor oscillations of the parts of centers. Let's see how this chart or pattern applies to the very abbreviated and simplified evolution of life. We must now consider the scale 0 octave to be the entire octave of organic life, not just humanity. The very first moment of life begins with the 2 of diamonds, DNA, the molecule that could copy itself. As life became more complex, multicellular aquatic plants, like the algae, appeared. Then more complex plants, like the mosses, which invaded the land and began to make the atmosphere oxygen-rich. As the queen and king of diamonds developed, there were plants with specialized tissues to move, absorb water, and seek light, roots, stems, and leaves. The vascular plants, like ferns. The gymnosperms then developed naked seeds, like the redwoods, and finally, the flowering angiosperms developed, with seeds that included concentrated packets of carbohydrates, like sunflowers, which would soon make the spread of warm-blooded mammals possible. Some plants even developed moving parts to catch insects, like the Venus flytrap. This completed the evolution of the plant kingdom, represented by the ace of diamonds. The development of the cell control chemistry that allowed plants to seek light also made possible the development of moving single-celled animals, like protozoa with flagella. It was the beginning of the moving center and animals. Soon colonies of cells appeared, then multicelled aquatic invertebrates with specialized tissues, like trilobites, and land invertebrates like the earthworm. Because every organism has its own line of evolution, billions of lines of both animal and plant evolution continue to develop simultaneously, overlapping each other and co-evolving. Then came the insects and the vertebrates, starting with the cold-blooded reptiles, then dinosaurs, and some reptiles began to care for their eggs, like some snakes, or their young, like crocodiles. The development of the moving setter is followed by a large gap in the chart before the second scale 1 inner octave begins. According to this system, this gap was passed only with the aid of an assisting octave, in this case, the octave of astral energy, the energy of the emotional center. With that assisting octave, animals began to develop caring for their young, again in service of the duplication principle. With more care, the survival rate increased substantially. As warm-blooded animals, like the birds, then mammals, like the kangaroo, began to thrive, bearing live young, the three lower centers began to unify to produce loyalty to the herd, the group. Birds flew in flocks, wolves ran in packs, elephants, chimps, and hominids lived in troops. The higher emotional center came into being. But in humans, after the development of the beginnings of reason, it was largely lost. As the image expands to show the entire chart, it is clear that the higher emotional center, at scale 0, can only be formed by the unification of the instinctive, moving, and emotional centers, the aces of diamonds, clubs, and hearts. Further, the higher mental center, also in scale 0, can be formed by the unification of the intellectual center, the higher emotional center, and the higher mental center itself. For this second unification to happen, the intellectual center needs to step down to become the mechanical part of the higher mental center. And the higher emotional center, conscience, needs to step down to become the emotional part of the higher mental center. These upper two functions, the third octave of scale 1, become the upper story of a fully developed human being. But this development can only happen consciously by intentional work. Why? Because, as seen in the original card diagram laid out on the notes, great nature can only complete the Enneagram up through the note law, conscience. And passing the gap between the second scale 1 octave to the third scale 1 octave also requires the participation of a second assisting octave from outside of organic life, the higher mental octave. This must be accessed intentionally. The octave of reason of human beings, extending from law to T in scale question mark, must be accomplished through individual intentional